This podcast for the Solution Focus in Organizations Library is an online recording of Jonas Wells talking on the history of Solution Focus for the SFiO Global Chapter in June 2019. Let's get started, and just to give you a bit of background, you may remember on the 3rd of May we did a Solution Focus in Organizations FICA coffee morning, and right at the end of that there was only 3 of us left. There was Jonas and Tim and myself, and Jonas and Tim just started having this really great conversation about the history of SF. And I know Jonas has been doing lots of research into that. And I just said to him, would you like to do a SFiO Global Chapter on this? And I'm delighted to say that he said yes. Thank you very much indeed, Jonas, for coming all the way from your holiday cabin in Gotland. And I'm going to hand over to you to run the session.
Oh, wow. I'm just so chuffed about seeing everybody arriving and all these wonderful faces. Many of them I know and respect so well. I mean, I'm already losing words. This is going to be a tough experience for me. I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much, John, for asking me. I don't know why I do this, but I put myself into situations sometimes where I just want to give myself a challenge, and this is a big challenge for me. And I'm hoping that this will somehow turn out useful, as we know when we meet. Yes, I have been doing some research. The last 3 months, I've been going into the history of solutions focus. There's a lot to be learnt. I found it's doing lots of stuff with me, and it came to the surface when I was talking to John and Tim a couple of months ago. And it feels great to have the chance to just reflect and talk with you guys and see what emerges, really. I have an idea, but I'd like to focus quite generally on ethics, maybe, and also on the preconditions for change. I mean, looking at our own approaches, Emergence, as an example of how we discover or learn new things. It was a long journey for those involved, and I think that hard work is not unnoticed, not by me anyway. And I'd like to maybe honor that somehow, maybe learn from how solutions focus emerged. Is there something to be learned there that we can use going forward? That's a general kind of like a research question for this session, I guess. Can we learn from the history? Is there something here that we can make use of in the future as we go forward, wherever we are, from whichever point we are in or at? I have created some material, I thought, and in a moment I'll start sharing that stuff with you. I've done a PowerPoint presentation. I hate PowerPoint presentations, but I just thought this is the easiest way to communicate with so many, and it also creates some form of structure and some form of documentation. So it could be useful. I've also done kind of a timeline on an Excel spreadsheet from 1952 to this year, significant events in the history of solutions focus. And I've never seen anybody has done that before. Maybe you've got similar things in your computers, but I've never seen it. So I'd like to share that. There'll be time for a breakout room somewhere in the middle where we could pause and reflect. And I'm hoping to have some music at the end of it. I mean, I like doing stuff with music, so maybe we'll get into some dancing. Who knows? If we can do that globally. Let's do a soul cabaret. Yeah, we could just do dancing for a few minutes as we clear our minds and help us to reflect. Who knows? If that's okay, shall we get started? Then I'll start sharing. Can you all see this? So anyway, this is the title. And maybe I should say something who I am, because many people don't know who I am, maybe. I live and work in Sweden. I work with organizations. I work with coordinating several public health organizations, the Social Insurance Office, Job Center, 3 municipalities, a healthcare system, and their joint efforts. And they really like solutions focus. So I get to do lots of training and supervision and courses and just work in daily life with them with the solutions focus. We've been doing that for several years, and Mia is one of the people who's been to our courses and learnt a lot and doing amazing stuff. She's here. There's quite a few of us doing lots of solutions-focused good work, and I kind of support that through something called a coordination agency, which is a very Swedish construct where we finance joint efforts between the different organizations. So it enables us to do lots of good stuff together. And solutions focus is their preferred way of working. So that makes me very, very happy, because then I have something to offer, even more, I think. And I've been connected to solutions focus since the early 2000s, when I met Björn and Eva. Björn Johansson and Eva Persson, and I'm forever in their debt. They really opened the world to me, literally speaking, because I made a big debut at the Seoul World Conference in 2004, when we were talking about the work we were doing in the area of Sweden we were working in. So that was really great. But I'm an anthropologist, and that might be significant. It might not be, but I think it is a little bit for me anyway, because I'm trained in a way, in the same way that John Weekland is trained, Gregory Bateson was trained. Other anthropologists, I think, have done a lot of significant work to influence the approach, looking at things as a whole and being very mindful of conversations. That is the primary material for anthropologists. And I'm still very influenced by anthropology. Maybe that shows, who knows. Anyway, that's a little bit about me. The title is very grand. Please don't have too high expectations, but I'm hoping that something new will emerge in our looking at this. Before we start, 2 quotes. Mikhail Bakhtin, famous Russian linguist from the 20s, 30s, pre-war, was very much into dialogue as a way we communicate, and looking at the world through that lens. Lovely quote: "You can never predict the future by the past, because the past is changing all the time." And this goes very well with the idea of rumour that Steve and Gail introduced 15 years ago, something. We spread rumours about what's happened. And I think maybe this is what we're doing now. So with deep respect to our own personal history and what we've learned from Solutions Focus so far, this is my take, and it's probably wrong. It most definitely is, because it's a rumor, but it's what we have. And I think there's still a lot to be learned from history, but we all have different versions of it, and that's fine. That's natural. And then Insu, this lovely quote: "It's perhaps difficult to see just how radical Solutions Focus brief therapy is without looking at its historical roots." And this brings me up to where I am right now, or what I've been doing the last couple of months. I feel I've taken a step last six months to go full time really into training, and seeing myself as a trainer, primarily a trainer. I haven't really done that before. And I think it's important to be intellectually honest. You know, where are my ideas coming from? If I'm to talk about them, or if I'm to help people learn about them, then I think it's important to be honest about them and where they come from. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to do some research. And the other thing was, I'm doing a book on assumptions and presuppositions of solution focus, and they aren't without history. They come from somewhere. They have their history. I'd like to learn more about that. I've written the book in Swedish already, but I'm currently writing a book in English where I'm expanding on it. And this is a nice thing to expand on. So where do the ideas come from? Where do the assumptions originate, or where can we put them in time? Be nice. And then what really sparked the whole thing was a comment by Peter de Jong. I was in a course with him and Hasten Moon, and he said something on the side about how fascinated he was with the early period of solutions focus, 1978 to 1985, before it was even called solutions focus. What happened in that time was so inspiring and fascinating for him. And I thought, I don't really know much about that time. I've got to learn. So what sparked his fascination somehow sparked a fascination in me. Yeah, and when I decide to do things, I kind of do all in. So that basically is all I've been doing for my free time, is going through articles about the history of solutions focus. So what is it? How can we understand the history of solutions focus? Anyway, that's a little bit about me and where I'm coming from. Let's interact. Have you all got the opportunity to see a chat room? There's a chat function on Zoom.
Yeah,
and you can all press it.
I can do that.
Shall I stop sharing? I can stop sharing, right?
Yeah, I'll break them out.
No, if I stop sharing like that.
Okay, I'll put people into breakout rooms. What would you like them to talk about?
We could. What I'd like to suggest is we use the chat room. The chat.
All right. Okay.
And in the chat,
it said a breakout room.
Because then we can see everybody's as it emerges. So, what would you like to be different from today, from our talk today? What would you like to be different? What would please you the most? What would please you the most to be different after today? If you'd like to type it in the chat room, I'd be chuffed. Even more. Love it. Radical early years. Wow. Yeah, I have a leaning towards punk and radical. I kind of like radical. Learn from the fruits. I don't know. Oh well. That sounds very lovely. The mutual influence of many people from the early days. Yes, Dominic and Elfie, that's true. It really is a collective. It really is. And I like to go into that a bit, actually. So lovely that you bring that up. Timeline idea. So that's nice. I'll share that with you in just a sec. Value what there already is, connected to new territory. Lovely. Yes. Yes. I have some ideas of how we can move forward. There are some ideas of how we can explore a further development of solution focus. I have a couple of ideas. So that would be something I'll be sharing, hopefully discussing with you lot. Wow, thank you so much. Did you all catch that? You all got to see the list as well. Isn't that amazing? Thank you everybody for your input so far. That's lovely. You seem to be in the right place. Shall I go to the next step? So what we're going to do is have a look at the timeline. We're going to go very quickly, briefly through Milton Erickson and MRI. So the 50s and 60s and early 70s, we're going to have a quick look. I'm going to try and spend most of my time looking at the early period before it was called SF. I want to look a little bit how radical Steve Deshaies really is. I'm going to try and give a short cheer for Eve Lipchick. I know she's revered of many, but I'd like to press her input in the solutions focused history a little bit more. I'd like to remind us of the nymphomania case. Many of you might have heard of it, many of you might have not, but it changed the whole thing in the late 80s for Steve. He had to start all over, and I find that significant for our history. And then I want to round it up with lessons and questions that we have for future SF development. So that's the quick outline of today. Let's start with a timeline. There's a lot of data here. So as we can see, 1952, something significant happens. Gregory Bateson receives a research grant. And with that research grant, he collects people around him like John Weakland, Don Jackson, Richard Fish, and they explore patterns of communication and cybernetics and systems theory and stuff. It's all very brainy from Gregory Bateson's point of view, but I think Milton Erickson helps them to ground it, to make it very practical and look at language, how it's really used. So Milton Erickson is there from the beginning as an inspiration for the people, and a lovely article from 1954, and then Gregory Bateson et al.'s article from 56, which introduces the interactive perspective on sickness and health through schizophrenia. It's mostly famous for the double bind theory. In the article is the idea of interaction that we find so precious. The action is in the interaction. It starts there somehow. There are earlier signs of it, but it gathers a lot of momentum and pace from that article. They start the Mental Health Institute. There's a training program. Jay Haley writes a book which directly influences Steve Deshaies, and they turn the ideas from Gregory Bateson into practical family therapy language, really. Don Jackson dies in 1968. He's very influential. I haven't got time to talk about him that much, but it's somebody I'd love to learn a lot more about because he really was influencing everybody else at that time. And he was allowed to publish stuff very early. He got stuff out there very quickly. Steve Deshaies opens a practice in San Francisco, and then we have other books and articles coming out telling you about the MRI model. We have Stephen Insull meeting in California. I've had two different dates, 73 or 77. I think it's 77. And they fall in love immediately, love at first sight. And within weeks, they move in together. I think they move in together and they move to Milwaukee. It goes very quickly. And it's both a professional relationship and a romantic relationship. They start something they call them MRI of the Midwest. You've probably heard this before. They start BFTC, which is like an MRI of the Midwest in 1978, first in the living room of their house, but then they upgrade it over the years. I like to say something about Don Norum. He was a part of the gang that was around the time, and he, like a precursor of solutions focus, his ideas were not ready for the time, I suppose. But he introduced the idea of the family has the solution. It was in the title of his paper, wasn't published until long after. But he also, the idea of a pre-session change, he regularly asked his clients what they'd already been doing that was useful when they phoned up to book a meeting, and he found that very useful. But it wasn't really taken on board by the others. But there are people saying that Steve was very influenced by him, but it's not published that he was. Who knows? Don Norham is kind of like an interesting guy. Then we have lots of different interventions starting to coming out. You have the idea of resistance very early on questioned and changed, which also changes the way of exploring what's working in solutions focus, what turns out to be solutions focus. I'm not going to go too much into all this because I'm going into this in a minute. But the early period starts in 78 and ends roughly around 85. And what ends it for me is it becomes more of a model after 84, 85. And before it's more like an exploration of trying to find what is the model or what is working. And also in that time, things aren't really published. The Death of Resistance, the article takes 5 years to get published. And his first book comes out 82. I don't know if it makes such of a splash, but around 84, 83, 84, they get a lot of interest from outside their group. They're very like a small group, diverse group, but very much on their own in the beginning. But at the end of the 84, 85, they're doing trainings and people are coming out to see them and getting involved with them. Gail Miller, Michelle Wiener Davis and stuff. Lots of other people get involved. I think that changes a bit the dynamics of the group, and they become more technical, model focused, and also very much into techniques, I think. And which really is the later period signifies, all these scaling questions, the what's better questions, pre-session change, the centrality of the miracle question comes up in the later period. And all that we recognize as solutions-focused techniques become verbalized and written about. Until 89, a big change happens in how we frame solutions focus, and we're going to get into that in a minute. And then we have lots of other good stuff going on in the 90s. Other people get involved. Scott Miller, the idea of not knowing becomes out there, leading from behind. A couple of great books, Words Will Read Your Magic and More Than Miracles. And naturally, we also know that Steve and Insoo, they die in the early 200s, and other things come out. Mark and Harry's article and In Between, I think, is very significant. We have the microanalysis work coming out. We have all these lovely organizations, the EBTA, the SFBTA, the AASFBT in Australia, World Conference. I've got Elfie and Dominic's podcast here on the list because I think it's very significant. And SF World Day, which I also think is something a nice way to end this timeline. Are there any comments from the group about this? There's a smiley face from Port. Is it useful? Is it somehow? Is it useful? We could add on this. There's lots of stuff we could add. Svea's happy to. Well, there's just a quick look. You can look at this in depth on your own later on. You can share it and build on it. It would be lovely to have it expanded. The more we find out about the history and when things happened, I think we get a kind of this helps us to see a whole picture of the history. But let me get into some other stuff. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint now. Let's have a quick look at Milton. And
what would we have heard?
Well, you'd have heard.
Sorry.
You would have heard of it, him talking about a client, and the client was crying. And it was a lovely story of him bringing out a flower pot. And he says, we could gather your tears in this flower pot because even tears are useful. And that's it, really. The story of and the idea of that when we cry, we have additional shame, so that makes the crying continue, and we feel, bad. But his instinct was to see it as a resource, and I think that it's a very significant way of somehow just a minute of Milton talking about how he finds clients resourceful. And I think this is probably the basic idea of solutions focus, and it comes from Milton. So when we talk about our work being very much influenced by Steve and Insoo, maybe I've been influenced by Rita Malkamaki. She's done a lot of work with Ernest Rossi and Milton Erickson. And for her, it's absolutely clear, and for me, it's becoming more and more clear that our work is so derivative of Milton. Milton inspired everyone in this field because of this simple idea of that our clients have resources. And actually the beginnings of solutions focus start in a way with Steve trying to understand what Milton is doing. And it's a misunderstanding. I'll be getting into that in a minute. But from Milton, there's a lot of stuff from Milton that we don't use, But there are stuff that we do use that is very relevant today. And the idea of utilization, using what's there, is in Milton's work. He has a future orientation or method of working. He wants to look at what's going on. He wants to move forward. He doesn't do analysis of the past. He wants to find steps forward. He's non-normative. There's no prescription. Every client is different. What baffles people at the time, he has outlandish tasks. He gets people to do crazy stuff, I suppose. And people are very taken aback by that because they don't know what his method is when he does these tasks. He finds a therapist as responsible, which is very against the grain at the time for results and progress. He starts the whole idea of brief therapy to make it as short as possible. And to round it off, the incredible faith he has in people's resources. Next, I'm just going to show you a little bit on MRI. MRI is very influenced by Milton, of course. As I said before, they make it very practical, make Gregory Bateson's ideas very practical. And it's interesting going through the material about the history because, I mean, some people elevate Gregory Bateson and other people don't. They do the opposite because they find Gregory's idea very abstract and very difficult to make very practical. But through MRI and through Milton, and I think John Weekland plays a huge role in this, and so does Don Jackson and they all do in different ways. They try to make therapy very practical. So I'm trying to understand Milton. They focus on several things, and they focus on not so much the problem, and they frame their attempt as a therapist to try and stop what the client is doing to solve their problem, because what they're doing is inadvertently perpetuating it. They focus on observable behavior in interaction. It's interesting to note that Bevan Bavalas was a part of this group in the late 60s, and the first big book on interaction in human communication is she writes together with many of these people that I've mentioned already. So the whole idea of microanalysis could say starts here as well, but she goes in a different path. But the idea of interaction is very much central for them. There's no attempt to understand the problem. The idea of staying on the surface is there. I mean, they are problem focused. It's not solutions focused, but they don't delve into the problem. They don't look at underlying causes, for instance. And they like promoting change rather than insight and stuff. John Weekland has this idea of small steps is all it takes, is enough. It's something we use today. And there's a shift from what's inside and why to instead what's between and what's next. It's all there. And you can see that what becomes solutions focus, it grows out of MRI. I mean, the basic building blocks are already there. The idea of working with a team is something that Steve and Insu used when they start at BFTC in 1978. We don't use the team as much today, but it was an important bridge into where we are today that they actually brought that on board as well. Next picture. Why is Steve so radical? Well, first of all, there's this tale. I like to tell this. There's this short story, which I've kind of picked up in the material, but also from talking to Harry Corman. And I think it's a story that Harry often repeats, but I'd love to tell the story here with you. In the late 60s, Steve is in a library waiting for a friend. And I'm probably getting the story all wrong, and I'm probably going to change it somehow, but bear with me. Anyway, he's in this library waiting for a friend, and his friend is late, or he's early, but he has time, and he looks over on the shelf, and he finds a book, and it's Jay Haley's Strategies of Psychotherapy. And he picks it up, and it's a book on, I haven't read it, but I hear it's a book on Jay Haley's understanding of Milton Erickson. And in the book, he says that Milton has no theory. And Steve says, well, that's nonsense. He's got to have an idea of how he's doing. So Steve picks up all the other books on the shelf and tries to read them. They're not useful. But what starts here is Steve tries to figure out what Jay Haley has missed. So he goes into Milton's case files, and he managed to find some form of structure, understanding of them, if he can look at half of the case files. There's about 500 case files, and he can see that there's an idea which he understands Milton to be using. And from this idea, he starts a practice in 1969, and on his own, practicing what he thinks Milton Erickson is doing. And the other half of the case files, which he doesn't understand, he just writes them off as odd. And he starts using the model as he thinks it's used from Milton. So in effect, how Steve gets into therapy, I mean, he's a social worker. And he's like in his late 20s, early 30s. He starts trying to, he uses a model which he thinks is Milton's model. I hear later on, when he actually gets to see Milton work later on in the 70s, he gets surprised and says, he's doing it all wrong. He's not doing it as the way I understand it. So it's very much a misunderstanding of Milton Erickson's work. But the idea that he takes this work very seriously and starts using it is very radical. I mean, could it be done today? I'm not sure. But he starts his own private practice and starts trying to figure out what's going on in successful therapy. He's very hooked on the idea of not explaining. He likes to describe what's going on, which is also a very cool thing that he has there right from the start. From this work, he designs a research question. What is the therapist doing that is useful? And in the 80s, this changes to what is a therapist and client doing together that is useful. He's not after theory of human behavior. He's very clear on he's not interested in theory, why people act or do in a certain way. He's more interested in theory of practice and what people actually do, what really happens in the session. He's a true believer in interaction. It's already there from the beginning. Makes it very difficult, of course, to do explanations then. You can only really describe what's going on, but you can't actually explain it. Later on, he comes up with the idea of cooperation instead of resistance. It's a cooperating, it's a verb rather than a noun. In this time, in the 70s, resistance is the reason for therapy. You have to break down the client's resistance for them to change patterns of behavior. That is the reason for going into therapy. But he's the first person really who puts into words the idea of cooperation instead of resistance. That what we do is cooperate with our clients, their way of cooperating with us. And for this, he gets a lot of heat when he publishes Death of Resistance in 1984. But the idea is old at the time for him. That's really interesting how he goes against the grain. He has his own idea. And then another thing which I find radical about Steve, that he changes his whole idea of how can we understand what's going on in therapy 3 times. So first he has like the MRI style, which is very like early 70s style, which is similar to Bill Haley's and John Weakland's ideas of how to conduct therapy. Changes to ecosystemic, which is you cannot be outside of the system, you're a part of the system. Therefore, the therapist and the client, what they do together is much more interesting what the therapist or the client is doing on their own. And then 1989, very clear, this post-structural Wittgenstein social constructionist step, which radically changes his whole idea of what we're doing. And I also think he opens up for another step, which is in activism and embodiment. It's a slight adjustment from social constructionism, but it's taking the step a bit clearer, or maybe that's something I'd like to learn more about. So what are the implications for inactivism on solutions focus? But he does open the door for that. Right, thank you for bearing with me so far. It's lovely to see you all still here. I'd like to get into the meat of my presentation, which is the early period of SF. This is the period that starts in 78 and ends around 84, 85. I'd like to focus on, I will be going through some of the interventions that they designed and some of the stories that were happened from those interventions. But I'd also like to point out the cultural context of the group. They go into this group, the work of the BFTC, the way of working in the BFTC, with an idea of that they do simultaneously, they do research, they try to figure out what they're doing through theory, and they do practice. And it's like a recursive, it's like it goes round and round. So they're doing studies as well as they're doing practice. They're taking their work extremely seriously. They have a lot of time on their hands. So they videotape everything. They watch these tapes over and over again. They have teams looking on a conductor, which is their early idea of a therapist interviewing a client. They have communication between the observation room and the conductor or the interview, so they can go in and ask things even if you're not in the room. They have a very, developed idea of how to reflect and document what's going on in therapy. The recent idea I heard was that they primarily took on very difficult cases. I mean, they really, if they were cases that were other people couldn't help or didn't know what to do, they took them on. So they were very experimentative and experiential, I think, in their way of working. They wanted to experience and see what was going on with their own eyes, and there was also an idea of everybody's doing this together. Anybody should be able to explain what they're doing. So it's very communal, very collective, which I find fascinating. That changes later on. I'd like to add the socio-cultural context a bit to this, because they do label themselves as the MRI of the Midwest, which is, I suppose, a way of saying that they're outside of power centers in the States. So they're like in the outback. They're allowed to do things on their own. Nobody really knows what they're doing. They're not very public. They have contacts, of course, with MRI, with John Weekland primarily, but then they're very much on their own, and they have that sense of feeling also in Milwaukee, where they work, that they're very much on their own, and they're very different. They gather also a very colorful group, all have a similar kind of stance, morally, ethically, politically, maybe. There's Steve, there's Insu, Eve Lipchik, Elam Nonnelly, who's a professor of social work, Jim Dirks, who worked with Insu, sorry, Marilyn Lacour. These are kind of like the main people in the beginning, but there are other people too, Alex Molnar, and later on Michelle Wiener-Davis, and a whole bunch of other people, Gail Miller too. A very interesting first study that they do in 1978-79, I think, is they count head nods, because they want people to do the tasks that they give them. And one of the things I find significant for that is if the client is in the session nodding and being very receptive and responsive, then this is a good thing. So the idea of counting head nods is a good idea to be able to know if the task that they give to the client is a good task or not. But what they discover from this is that they get to see what the therapist is doing, because a head nod is nothing isolated. It's something to do with what the therapist is saying or doing at the time, which leads to this idea of cooperating, which then leads to the idea of death of resistance. And in 1979, Insu writes a short piece on the obituary of resistance, where resistance peacefully died and was buried in the backyard of Insu and Steve's house. There's even an idea of a shrine in the observation room where they can pay their respects to resistance. But this is already 78, 79, these ideas coming out. This is very early. It wasn't published until 5 years later. A very significant thing happens also very early on in 78, 79. A client who's in the room with the conductor, the therapist, wants to know what the team is thinking about what's emerging in the room. And so she asked, very plainly, can I hear what the team is thinking? And naturally, the therapist says, yes, of course. So, and they do that. And then they discover that the team isn't outside of the system. It actually is part of the system. It's part of the group. They cannot act as if it's not. And this is the idea. This changes the idea of what the system is. And they talk about the ecosystem. So there is no vantage point outside of the client. We are already involved, all of us. Another story, 1982, something very significant happens. There's a client that comes in, and there's different, in the stories I've read, somebody says there's 27 problems, another says 17, another says 23. But whatever the case, this family, when they try to list their problems, they have lots and lots of problems. Almost in resignation, the team goes, so what don't they want to change? What would be, the intervention task. So there's so many things going on here. So what don't they want to change? and the team, and then the client comes back, and lots of things are different. And this, but they have no idea of knowing what has been different. Which problem is it that they've addressed? And this is like the first kind of crack in the facade, as it were, of problem thinking, and the light of solution focus starts to shine, because a different language is emerging from this first formula session task, which they evolve, which is basically saying to whatever person, with whatever problem, as an intervention, look out for things that you don't want to change. Notice what you'd like to keep happening. It works, a treat. I can't remember the number right now, but is it like 60, 70, 80% of the clients come back very happy, and change is happening much faster than they anticipated, which makes them more and more interested to talk about, so what were they been doing that want to keep happening? And this gets into exceptions and pre-session change and stuff. So the whole first formula session task opens up for a whole range of questions that we perceive today as very solutions focused. We go from mechanic to engineering to more maps and models. So before, the tasks were important and trying to be very clever, but now we'll become more descriptive about what's actually going on in the session and collaborate with the client. So the maps and model become more interesting than being mechanical or engineering. There are 3 different versions of how the miracle question came about, which is interesting. One is, of course, from Milton Erickson. He came up with the idea of the crystal ball. Steve has been writing about this in the 70s, so it was naturally something they tried out. Look in the crystal ball, what's different in the future, what would you be doing, etc. Another version is the version of Insu responding to a client, the client saying, "Oh, that would take a miracle." And she said, "Well, what if? What if a miracle happened?" This is like 82 or something. And then there's another version. Jim Wilkes has a lovely version where he observes Steve working, and he asks a similar kind of question to what if a miracle happened? And he, in conversation with Steve, points out its significance, that this question is different from all the other questions that we ask. There's something worth exploring here. And Steve kind of goes, "Okay, let's try it. Let's do that then." And the next day, he asks the question again, and they count all the positive responses from the client, and were astounded. And from there, it evolved. And in the beginning, miracle question isn't central to solution focus. In the middle 80s, it becomes much more central, almost sacral, really, to what solutions focus is. You have to ask the miracle question. The miracle question is the quickest, easiest way to go to change. But in the beginning, it's like a technique amongst many, and it's not central. It's kind of like, it's something they discover along the way. And this goes back to my point of the socio-cultural context. Maybe they weren't really ready for that. Maybe it's something that had to change. Their context had to change. They had to have a clearer idea of what they were after in order to recognize the significance of the miracle question. I'd like to do a small piece on the skeleton keys. Many of the techniques they find work with many different problems. The first formula session task was one of them. Miracle question is another. And the idea that you only need to know a few simple things in order to address any problem at all is summed up in the idea of skeleton keys. And I've managed to find a short dialogue between Brian Cade and Steve DeShazer in 1985, where they kind of sum up the idea of skeleton keys. So I would like to reenact this dialogue somehow, and I want 2 volunteers. Where's the word? There we go. Share. Right. So who would like to be Steve?
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to be Brian, please. It's Jenny here. I'd like to be Brian.
Excellent. Let's go ahead. So, Steve and Brian, take it away.
Yeah.
We now believe that interventions need only fit the constraints of the problematic situation, much as a skeleton key fits a lock.
People usually associate each lock with having its own unique key. So the idea of a skeleton key is presumably an important one.
Yes. You don't need to know the precise nature of a lock to use a skeleton key. And a fairly small bunch of skeleton keys is all that's needed to be able to open a vast range of locks to help people get on with their futures. And that's how you judge your effectiveness. If the key works, you can open that door.
So that means that in therapy, you don't have to be so concerned with ascertaining the precise nature of the problem.
Correct. There are cases in which you can do the whole therapy without needing to know what the problem or complaint is. It is sometimes useful to have some ideas about how the client perceives the problem in order to know how to frame interventions, but theoretically it's not necessary.
Your approach seems very similar in some ways to that of Milton Erickson, in that he believed that people have a vast reservoir of abilities, and that therapy was not a process of putting something into people or replacing deficiencies, but of unlocking what is already available to them.
Absolutely, we call this the Wizard of Oz technique. We don't give them anything that they haven't got already. For instance, to give you one example, a couple came in and I asked the husband what it was that had brought him here. He said that some of their fights led to physical violence. I turned immediately to the wife and asked what happens when they don't. We spent the rest of the session talking about what happens when they don't get physically violent with each other. I never found out about the fight pattern. I have no idea who got violent with whom.
Which traditionally a therapist would be primarily concerned with finding out who did what and to whom and how often, etc., etc.
Including me 4 or 5 years ago.
So, you're particularly concerned with what people are already doing well. When people come into therapy, they've usually become preoccupied with what's going badly, and they're not aware of the many things that they're also doing quite competently.
Yes, most of the time.
Hasn't this Steve got a lovely voice?
Thank you so much, Anton and Jenny. Wow, thank you.
Welcome.
How about a 5-minute breakout rooms, groups of 3 or 4? Focus on, so what is it that fascinates you about the early period of solutions focus? I mean, what's going on here that is enabling all these lovely things to emerge, this change to happen? In 4 or 5 years' time, Steve says, is changing, his thinking is changed. So can we creatively kind of discuss or reflect, pause and reflect? So what is going on here that enables all these lovely things to emerge? Should we think about that for a moment? I want to lift up Eve Lipchik a bit. I think her role is understated, maybe. She really liked the idea of being able to talk with her client without interruption. And she managed to argue that very persuasively early on, that don't interrupt me. I want to talk to my client. It's disrespectful for the client if you interrupt me all the time. And she is, in my way, the way I look at it, an early champion of prioritizing the interview as more important than the intervention or trying to understand the problem. She does more than that as well. She also very early on asked the question, how will you know when you don't need to come here anymore? Which is also very like a precursor for the solutions focused way of working. And she's very mindful of that. And later on, she also builds on the miracle question. What of the miracle is already happening already? And coping questions. And this idea of listening with a constructive ear is something that she adds to the model. And the idea of listening as being very important. I think Eve and Insu, in a way, I never met either Eve. I haven't met Eve either, but I never met Insu or Steve. But I imagine that Eve's role as a practitioner, as a therapist, played a huge role. It's not just Insu. I think it's Eve as well that people are very inspired by. And then what really gets me is her pioneering work with domestic violence, where she has a very easygoing relationship with political context, which I think is something that I'd like to explore more of. Svea and I are doing a course with Kirsten and Jeff Chang at the moment, where we're comparing narrative therapy to solutions therapy. And the idea of politics and how that can play a part in the work we do is much easier in the work of Eve Lipchik and Yvonne Dolan than it is in Steve and other people doing solutions focus. So there's something there to be learned maybe, but I think Eve was already doing stuff there, which is really interesting to find out more about. Quick thing, I don't know if we've got time, but the nymphomania case is really quick, really. Client comes in, wife and husband, there's a nymphomania is the idea. She has to have sex before she goes to sleep, and her husband is really tired, and this is very stressful for the couple. They try to talk about exceptions with a therapist, but it doesn't really work. She says, no, I want to have sex. I don't want to look up when I'm not having sex. I don't want to restrain myself. I want to be able to have a romantic relationship with my husband. I have a really difficult problem with nymphomania. I need deep therapy. Whereby the therapist turns to, I think it's Insu, turns to the husband, and he says, it's a sleep problem for me. And the wife says, oh, so do you have any cures for insomnia? And they start having a completely different discussion, a very technical, very easy-going discussion about what can help people sleep, and what they need, what they do to help them sleep. And 2 weeks later, everything's sorted. They don't even come back. They just send a note saying, we've sorted our problem. And this gets Steve thinking that, how can nymphomania slide into insomnia? It just doesn't work. The way to understand that is that we're in a social constructive Wittgensteinian language game where things can change really quickly, that reality and meaning is developed through negotiation, and there's nothing there to discover or uncover. There's no deep structure to reveal. Nymphomania means something in that context, for that family, in that conversation, and that can change. So this opens up for postmodernism as a frame for solutions focus. And this is written about very clearly in Putting Difference to Work, and later on also Words Were Originally Magic. So this changes the whole idea of solutions focus, and I think that's an important thing to notice where we are today, that this really informs us as a frame. Now, I just want to get to very quickly my two last slides were giveaways, what I'm learning from this. And the one thing is, looking at the early period and how the nymphomania case changes solutions focus, there is a focus on experience, not knowledge. We're looking to experience and describe change, not putting into a set model. We're prioritizing our experiences of what we're looking at, rather than trying to put things in a neat box, as it were. There's another thing I find important is the idea of participation, acceptance, openness, rather than manipulation or control. And manipulation and control could be that we have the model that we have to go through. But it's more important, I feel, in the early period, that to participate, to accept what's happening, to be open to what might happen is more important. And the idea of dialogue or dialectic is more important than method. So it's more important to talk to each other than having a set ideas of going into the room. And this for me sums it up as a kind of like, what's more important for us is possibilities, the investigation of possibilities, rather than looking at what's actually there. We're more interested in moving forward than looking at what's there in the present. And another thing that's come up for me is, which I think is informing my future work, is the idea of ethics and personal politics. And politics, it's not a question of being right or left. It's a question of making active choices in your world, guided by what you think is important in interacting with other people. Now, this guides me more than a solutions-focused model or something else. It's more important to me what constitutes my own ethics, my own morals, and then making choices from that than looking at what's in the model. And the other thing is, learning SF is a process in time. There's a lovely discussion going on right now on the SF list. Dominic and Elfie wrote a lovely piece recently. But it is a learning process in time, and it's like an anthropology trying to learn its field work. It takes time, and you're never really there. You keep learning as you go along, and we do it together. It takes two. We need to reflect both for ourselves, but also with each other, to learn what's going on. And then the idea of listening very carefully, which I take very much from really from all of them, but especially Eve. Listening with a constructive ear. That listening is the basic skill that we need to focus more on. So for me, SF is a response-based. It's better to be seen as a response-based approach. I mean, response both in terms of the client and also response in terms of the therapist. So what are we responding to is more important than what question we're asking. And then just to finish it off, what could we be doing more going forward? Well, I think the idea of Buddhism and Taoism is very underdeveloped in the literature on the history of solutions focus. There's quite a few points where it said it's very central, but actually very little on how it's central and what way. And I imagine Buddhism and Taoism is a lot more complex than what they make it. So if this was expanded upon, what would it change in terms of practice? I think the historical significance of John Weakland is probably understated. He was a mentor during the whole period and somebody who Steve had a deep relationship with and continuous relationship with. I've heard stories about Weakland's way of working is fascinating, and he was very silent, just as Steve was in his conversations. What else was picked up from John Weakland, I wonder? And then, as I said before, the ethics of Eve Lipchick and Eben Dolan, that they have a political sensitivity which they bring to the work, which I find something worth exploring and something I'm picking up from narrative therapy. Brief has done it a bit. They do a bit with so coaching the who, so asking, what's that say about yourself, for instance, in a conversation. But I'd like to learn more on how do we work in areas which are very political. Husband beating up her wife and being able to express or be very clear on our political points of view and still having a very helpful conversation. I think there's stuff to be learned from Eve and Van Dolen in this. But that's for me. I'd like to stop there. My presentation is over. I'd like to open up for whatever, really. Reflections, discussions, questions.
Well, can I just jump in? Can I just jump in first to say, I'd just like a few people, could you just give some appreciation to Jonas?
Words are still magic.
I'm new to this game. This is the sort of first or second one I've come into, and I'm just blown away by this community and how open and it is, and how willing to share ideas. And Jonas, that's been incredibly insightful, mate. It really has. It's really been good for me to understand the history of this. And you've obviously put a huge amount of effort in there. Just that one slide of the one spreadsheet of the history. I mean, you could probably talk about that alone for 2 or 3 hours. So yeah, just thanks for allowing me to be a part of it tonight. It was really good, and hope to get to meet all you guys at some stage in the future. So,
yeah,
thanks, John.
Love that. Thank you, John.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jonas, for putting together all these things and making visible. I mean, this is such a valuable contribution. And when you showed the timeline, I was really blown away. I said to Dominic, like, oh my gosh, this is such an amazing work you do here, because just showing all these, and well, I think it's on so many levels a very beautiful way to approach well, the history, not talking about this is the history, talking about the rumor of history. So there's, well, so many bits and parts, but one of the things that stands out for me is just that you showed in a very beautiful way to me that solution focus is not something that someone did, but that we all mutually influence each other, and that this approach is living from this mutual influence. So thank you so much for putting that together and for inviting us to mutually influence each other.
Wow, thank you. Wow.
You inspire and me to find back to this rumor type of understanding of SF. And I think in that case, teaching SF is giving experience with and telling rumors about SF. And these two things, I love to be reminded by this of today. Thank you so much.
Wow.
Thank you, Jonas. It's been wonderful to be part of this session. And I love the way you've told the story. It's a story that's new to me, and it's just very rich, very multifaceted. And I can see your passion, and I really value having had the opportunity to be with you all today.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Monica. And you.
Okay, so, and can I just say my personal thanks, Jonas, for taking on that challenge. I'm very happy to continue hosting this for another few minutes. People want to ask questions, but from the point of view of the formal time, we are over now. And I would like to thank everyone for attending. We had a 29 at one point, and for most of it.
Wow.
So really well done. It does say that Sundays tends to work well, and also that get a good speaker on and people will come.
Marco, again.
About your last flip chart, when you talk about you are looking for connection between Buddhism and Taoism. If
Yes.
you don't never read, I suggest you a book by Mark Epstein, and the book is Going to Pieces Without Falling Apart. It's really a great book about the present. It was my first book when I started, and then after that I met Steve DeShazer. And when I met him, I immediately recognized this presence attitude that Mark Epstein described in this book, like a connection with the Buddhism. So maybe help.
Thank you so much. In the 90s, I was a trainer of Qigong and Tai Chi and Kung Fu. I went to China as well and did training for different masters, and so I've got a kind of a youthful history in Tao Te Ching and and Buddhist and Taoist thinking, and I kind of get the sense that there's so much literature on Buddhism, but very little of it is referenced in the history of solution focus. So what does it mean to be Buddhist? In the Buddhist thinking, what is it that's Buddhist thinking in our way of working? There's a little bit of course, that change is happening all the time, and change is inevitable, but I think they're being a bit easy about it. I think there's something worth exploring there. And maybe, Marco, you're onto something there that maybe we should be more being present. How do we do that? If we're going to be responsive, there's something there could be written, I think.
I'm working on it. My really cool point is that how to use presence in solution focus. What I do in my training, I don't talk about solution focus, I talk about presence. Then we start to look to the technique. But before we need to understand and make experience of what present. Very, very nice. It's about jazz. Steve DeShazer was a jazz player.
Yes.
Before he became therapist, he was a jazz player. And very funny.
Yes.
And he spent a lot of time. And a lot of people that do solution focus play music. And people who play music only play music. You can do anything else if you really play. In this way, you are able to stay in the present moment. So people who play music have natural skill to stay in the presence. So maybe you become from Buddhist way, okay, you have the present. Maybe you become as Taoist or Qigong or something like that. Okay, it's present. Maybe you become from improvisation theater. Okay, it's presence. They play music, present. Okay, and this is the thing for me. From the difference between, for example, NLP people, a lot of NLP that I met in Italy, they work about structure, not about the presence. And this is the difference for me with solution focus.
So just building on what Marco was saying there, he just reminded me, you're talking about the Buddhism and the presence, Jonas. The Buddhism and the presence thing. This was the kind of the subject of things that I've done. I've not delivered anything in conferences. I've not been for a long time. But I remember it was the Cologne conference in 2008. Did a workshop on more soul to soul, and that was very much about the qualities of presence and building on the Buddhism thing really. And in I'm not sure which book it's in. I think it might be the book that Insu wrote with Peter Sabo. Maybe they talked about the roots of it being in Buddhism, but that's the only place I've ever seen it. And I remember bringing that up, and I remember at the time Mark Macargo saying, "There's no Buddhism, in SF." And I said, "Well, it says there is in this book." You know, given that Indu would have come from that Buddhist background, I've never found anything else, but it certainly is what underpins it. And the exercise that that I devised for that workshop in Cologne, the polo meditation, is the one that Marco is still using today with everybody.
But I wonder, I mean, if it's such a central idea to solutions focus, not just Insu was Korean, that's too superficial for me. I mean, what is the theoretical impact of it? What is it? What are the implications of that for practice? What does it do? What are we supposed to be doing when we're doing trainings? I mean, there's so much there which is not written. I mean, there's a lot of experience. I hear that in the group. I mean, as you say, it's nothing new that the idea of presence is important. But what does it mean for the theory or the writings or the history of solutions focus? I kind of feel when I'm looking at the earlier period and contrast it to the later one, the earlier period is more improvisational. There is more acceptance, there is more flexibility, there is more, and that might signal an idea of more presence, that is important for learning, which is not radical at all to say, but what are the implications of that when we train or when we teach?
You know, I was bowled away really by how many people put so much work into bringing it to something that now, if you look at it as the brief approach, or what Elliot Connie is teaching in his SF University, which is the brief approach, is essentially, you know, what are your best hopes and what does that look like? And it's so simple. And people now are coming to it, learning that without having to know anything else. Now, when Elliot teaches his approach, it's all about love and find the superhero, which is, you know, where's the superhero? Where are the qualities that are going to bring this through? I don't think there's any of them mentioned. Well, there is history, of course there is, but I didn't pick it up because I've done most of that before. But it's really interesting that, as I notice now, you know, we talk about the iceberg, what's above the waterline and what's below. You know, I've only got one hand, the other one's holding the phone, so I can't demonstrate. But, you know, if the iceberg is massive, it seems to me there's even more of it now below the surface. Because what's taught now and the approach that's being used, particularly in therapy, is tiny, tiny, tiny. You know, what are your best hopes look like? How much of it is already there? It's tiny, 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 but there's a massive amount that's allowed that to emerge.
Wow, that's a lovely picture in my mind. The iceberg that's become bigger.
Underneath has got bigger, and what's on the surface is so. You know, the bits that are actually what that's enabled.
Actually,
still quite early for me here.
Sunday morning.
I've not got very far into my coffee. So what that's enabled in terms of, you know, people can turn up and do outstanding solution-focused coaching, therapy work, etc., with a tiny, tiny segment done very simply and cleanly. But the effort that's taken to get there, you know, is that huge amount under the surface. And I think, thank you for today, because it's easy to think, oh God, is this all we do? I can't, you know, how do people charge money for this? And then you realize, actually, no, there's a lot behind it.
I wonder too, you know, there's a lot of written stuff on Buddhism when it comes to teaching. I mean, there's all these lovely stories on what the master says to the pupil and all these different, there's lots and lots of paradoxes and has a very pedagogical meaning. I mean, it's not random. It's very well thought through and used, you know, generational wise for centuries. You know, the kind of stories I'm after, you know, what the master says to the pupil and the pupil says something and the master says, you know, there's lots of those stories and they're very pedagogical. Contrasting that a bit to, I mentioned anthropology before, and there's a lovely anthropologist named Michael Agar. And he wrote a great book on the professional stranger, which is about how we do field work. How do we learn about what's going on in the fields that we're studying? And his idea was that basically we misunderstand everything, which is very much similar to solutions focus. And what it is a series of breakdowns. So we misunderstand, and then we try and attempt to understand, and then we misunderstand again. And that goes round and round and round. And it takes a lifetime to get to know anything. And the good anthropologist goes back to his or her field all the time and questions and revisions what it is that's happening, what they're learning. And I think that might be a parallel to the work that we do. Elfie wants to comment.
But I wrote an article on the parallels of Buddhism and SF, and I was looking for looking where it was quoted, and I found also an interview with Steve where he said, well, that there are connections. So, well, if this might be useful, I'm happy to send that to you. And I also stumbled across another article which I found very interesting, because it was something about the value of SF for people with a Buddhist background. So it was a study conducted by people somewhere in Asia. I don't know exactly who it was and where it was, but they talking about the connection or for the importance for training. So this might also be kind of interesting study. And this was a journal article somewhere. So they conducted a research study around the topic.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to share that.
Yeah. I'm going to let Marco wants to ask a question, but I'd like to just butt in. I asked Harry the question as well. I mean, what is the roots of Buddhism in solutions focus? And he said just as Mark, there was somebody saying that Mark responded in the same way, that it's not written up. So Harry said, you should post that on the SF mailing list and see what comes up. So maybe I'll do that. But there is something there to be explored. So Marco, go ahead.
So thank you, Sue. Maybe Sue, you remember our workshop in Jonas said.
Definitely.
Yeah. We lead the workshop. The title was Accogliere, a simple way to less is more. Accogliere don't exist in English as a word. It does mean, well, if we translate accogliere in English, the common translation is accept. But in Italy, accept is by mind. Accogliere is by heart. So it's a little different, and it's something to accept with art, welcoming or embracing. But embracing is very close, but it's not so close, like exactly what we mean. And what we mean with accogliere is more connected with the Buddhist attitude and with the, I don't know if you know sannyasis or Osho approach, this capability to stay in the present, to welcoming without judgment. So suspending the judgment, I just welcome everything happen, and I just be touched from what we arrive. In this way, this simple word, accogliere, it's the basically to less is more. Nothing to add, just to stay in the empty space and to be touched from it. And if you think in the metaphor of musicians are very sensitive person to be touched from things and transform this in vibration and in music. And when you listen to music that was building to say something, the music arrived to you because it comes from this accogliere. Thank you, Sue.
Wow, that's lovely. What comes to mind? What comes to mind is how trapped we are with our own language, and also culture. Different cultures can express different things, and there's a lovely example there from Italian, how we can have different ways of being present in our language. Maybe we don't have enough words for this in English, which makes it difficult for us to know.
And also, it's a really good point, and that was a lovely workshop, Mark. I mean, that's just taken me. What was it? The last thing you just said, Jonas? Sorry.
There's just the idea of how our language constrains our way of thinking or way of understanding the world, which is very Wittgensteinian. I mean, language is the method, the way we move in the world.
Yeah, and I think this is where the value of the bringing in the presence and the Buddhism thing, because so much of the SF, that history and development, is kind of above the neck.
Yeah.
So much of the explaining it, how it works, is above the neck. And so much of the joy in it is below the neck.
Well, why shouldn't we be able to write about that in a very intellectual way? I mean, Others can do it, but I don't think we've done that much of it. We should be doing more writings and theorizing about it.
Theorizing about what? Writing and theorizing about what?
What is the nature of presence in solutions-focused work?
Well, you can write and theorize about it if you want, or you could just do it.
I know. But I think it's important. But I think it's important. I mean, it's like Marco was saying, we start with presence, we start with listening, we start with responding, then questions, they come further down the line. You've got to listen to your client first, otherwise you're not having a conversation.
You intrigued me when you talked about presence, and I wonder if is that in the therapist? Is there a presence in the therapist when they're working with the client that leads to a kind of trust or whatever? But particularly in facilitating with teams, people often talk about that presence of the facilitator, you know, how that works with the team and how that helps the team work. So you just made me, I have no answers, but you just made me start thinking about that.
Thank you. It's a huge part of how I work. I can't not do it. If I'm not present, then I don't do good work.
I like SFiO was told, we had a chat before, and I think it was also in our mail conversations as well, that you also work very experientially. People learn by trying things out and then reflecting about it, right? And I'm gravitating towards similar types of exercises and style of training. And I think Jesper is nodding, he does that too. And I mean, that is significant that lots of us are prioritizing experience rather than knowledge. You know, it's not a passing down the model. It's not, this is the question to ask. It's exploring, it's building on what you already know and taking a small step forward together, which is like a seed for learning or way of teaching, or I don't know, or evolving solutions focus. I don't know. SFiO. I kind of referenced SFiO a bit, so.
I wanted to say that, I mean, it's a big topic. I want to underline, for me, it's an ethical stance. It has ethical implications because from a coaching perspective, coaching is unregulated. So if you want coaches to be self-regulating, then the relationship with self and knowledge and experience, for me, has to show up in the training. It can't be an expert-based training encouraging people to be ethically responsible for their practice. I don't understand that kind of an idea. So I think that this is a huge topic, which I know you have an interest in. And I'm just greatly delighted that you decided to spend your free time on doing all of this and not on starting a new business or building a house or something else.
I'm hopeless with all those things.
Oh, well, keep it like that. Keep that the same. And continue to be good at doing timelines, please. And I did, I think it's Dominic, but he's gone. I could imagine Dominic's illustration capability together with your timeline content being put into some kind of marvelous, I don't know, greeting card business, wallpaper, I don't know, all kinds of things.
That's a lovely idea.
Exactly.
But there is something about history which is nice. History informs our future rather than the past. It helps us move forward rather than backwards. So I'd like to have that in mind. With, timeline. What is it that helps us moving forward? Yeah.
I see a lot of similarities between how solution focus developed and is still developing, and the way that jazz is constantly evolving. I think maybe there's a link to explore there, as Steve was such a huge jazz fan and player. If you look at the history of jazz, it's not theory based. There is some theory behind it, so to speak. But it's constantly challenging this theory, adding things. Once something has been developed, they're always ready to break it up and start something new again. They're also not only influenced by what is happening in the history of in the catalog of jazz music, but they bring in other kinds of music. For example, the themes from Disney movies. and that openness and that creativity combined with we're doing this together. The musicians here on stage, we're playing together, we're here in the now. I like the comment of Marco, when you play music, you're there. You can be somewhere else, you're there. I like that, Marco. Then that's also something that I think is very particular to the history of solution focus. We're there, we're still developing, we're still sharing, and that's why I really want to say thank you, Jonas, for all this work and sharing and your openness there. For me, is the great fun of being part of this community. And I wonder, I'm not such a big expert in other kinds of theory or practices in therapy, but I wonder, could we make a comparison between how transactional analysis, for example, developed and solution focus? Or I had so many hours and years of training in psychoanalysis when I was a philosophy student, and what struck me is that everybody was trying to exceed himself or in the better understanding of Lacan or Freud or all these people, and they wanted to be more specialist in what Lacan was really saying or Freud was really saying. And I don't see that in solution focus, where our creativity is bigger than our desire for creativity, and to construct under this banner of solution focus is bigger than, pun intended, our anal search for what was maybe being said by Steve there or there.
Yeah, it's lovely. Still evolving, still being creative, still changing, still in the moment, still present.
What happened to the music? I'm hanging in there.
Oh, sorry. Should we finish with some music? Should we do some dancing? You want to do that?